So one of my favorite movies of all time is Shawshank Redemption. Anybody familiar with the movie? Good. If you're not, it basically traces the story of this successful banker who is wrongly convicted of a crime, and he ends up going to prison in this nasty, dank prison called Shawshank. And when he's there, he meets this group of people. They become friends, and key in those relationships is one old guy who's this wise sage among the group, played by Morgan Freeman, and his name is Red. And so as Red and this banker talk, and as their friendship progresses through the movie, one of their mutual friends is paroled. Haywood has been in prison for 50 years. He's been fighting for parole for decades, and he finally achieves the freedom he's been looking for. And as news begins to trickle back in from Haywood, they quickly realize he's not doing well on the outside. In fact, in a matter of just a few short weeks, the pressure gets to him. The pressure is too much, and he finally takes his own life. Waxing philosophic on the situation, Red says, these walls are funny. First you hate them, then you get used to them. Enough time passes, you even get so you depend on them. It's just a great quote about life, about our struggles. It's a perfect picture of where the Israelites find themselves after they're freed from 400 years of slavery in Egypt. The struggle that lies ahead of them is real. Everything they have learned about faith and religion and about God, they've learned for 4 centuries at the hands of cruel taskmasters, the Egyptian slave owners and masters. And what they had learned was completely wrong. There were not many gods, there was only one. And God is not fickle or capricious. God is holy and purely good. And God's blessings can't be obtained through magic or manipulation. But the good news is they are free to people who lovingly and willingly follow Him. The problem ahead of the Israelites is that God no longer fit within the walls that they'd grown to depend on. And as time went by, it got painfully obvious to them that they really didn't know God in the way He intended for them to know Him. We are in this series, The Story of God, and really working through together how God related differently to people all throughout the history of mankind. And if you haven't been here for the series, hopefully you're following along on the podcast, because they're kind of building in progression, and especially from today forward as we lead into Easter. This morning we're going to take a look at the period of time where God related to His people mostly through one leader and through the tabernacle. Now, when we pick up the story, God is meeting with Moses on the top of Mount Sinai. He's giving him what we refer to as the Ten Commandments, which was actually much more comprehensive than that. It was a complete moral and civil code that would guide the nation of Israel as they moved from being a people of slavery to a powerful, influential nation. And in that context, God announces to Moses, I'm moving into the neighborhood. Here's what He says: have the people make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I'm going to show you. And God goes on to give very specific, very detailed instructions for how to build the tabernacle, instructions about its form, about its function. In fact, it is the next 50 chapters of the Old Testament. Half of the book of Exodus, all of the book of Leviticus, half of the book of Numbers are spent telling what the priests will wear and how they'll serve, about the sacrifices that can be done, and about even the construction of this tabernacle, these specific types of wood and metal and fabrics that were to be used. God detailed how the tabernacle was supposed to be built, how it was supposed to be set up, how the people were supposed to camp around it, when they needed to move it, how it was supposed to be assembled and disassembled. It is an amazing and at times confusing set of instructions. I mean, just think of the last set of instructions you got with a piece of furniture from IKEA. That's kind of how some of this feels when you wade through those 50 chapters in the Old Testament. Dealing with this tabernacle wasn't easy. Moving it wasn't easy. Just the silver and gold used inside of the tabernacle weighed more than 5 tons. Each individual tent pole had a base that held it in place that weighed 75 pounds and was pure silver. It's crazy. To put it as simply as possible, what the Israelites were building, what they would end up with, was basically this elaborate tent-like structure that would serve them as a portable church for generations to come. The key thing to remember about this whole structure is God saying, I will dwell among them. Now, God's presence had clearly been visible through miraculous events all the way up to this point. From the point Moses shows up in Egypt and tells Pharaoh, you're going to let these 1 million+ slaves go, all the way through crossing the Red Sea on dry ground, to the bread and the manna and the quail that God provided on a daily basis. The cloud that Darren talked about last week that was there by day to guide them and filled with fire and guided them at night. God's presence had been pretty visible through these and other miracles that God had done along the journey. So why the tabernacle? What's the point in the story of God? So, to be honest, this idea of a tabernacle wasn't unique to Judaism. It was something that was present in a lot of cultures and a lot of faiths in that day. And even to this day, that they would make this kind of a portable worship place that would go with them and provide a place to worship God no matter where they are, their gods or the God of the Israelites. So the one that God constructed or ordered constructed was similar but had some very distinct differences, both in how it was designed and in how it typified the relationship that God wanted to have with his people. And even though we've got specifics on the type of materials to be used, on the size of the tabernacle, we really don't have an idea of what it looked like. I mean, Instagram was a few years away, you know. Aaron had run out of Polaroid film in his camera, so we don't have any snapshots. But this one, based on history, is a pretty realistic portrayal of what it would be, with the Israelites camped all around on all 4 sides. The tabernacle was basically this rectangular tent with a colored roof that you see, and then the surrounding area was called the courtyard. As a worshiper, you could enter the courtyard only through one of 3 entrances on the easternmost wall of the courtyard. And what was amazing was, as soon as you entered the tabernacle, that courtyard, you were confronted right away with this bronze-covered, 7.5-foot square, 4.5-foot high altar of burnt offerings. And it was for exactly what you think it sounds like. If you came to the temple to worship, you would bring an animal with you for a sacrifice. And as you walked through one of those 3 entrances, a priest would meet you. You would hand over the animal to the priest. You'd lay your hands on that animal and confess your sins. And then the priest would take it to the altar of burnt offering, slaughter it, and burn it there. Behind the altar of burnt offering was this huge basin made of bronze. And after that sacrifice, the priest would go wash themselves to become both physically and ceremonially clean and do the whole process all over again. The tabernacle was actually the much smaller structure inside the courtyard. It wasn't small, but it was smaller. It was 45 feet long, 15 feet wide, 15 feet high in its outer walls. And it was separated into 2 sections, roughly the initial first 2/3 and then the last third. That first section was called the holy place, and then the last section was called the most holy place. Only the priests were allowed inside the holy place, and there you saw the first distinction between the pagan tabernacles and the tabernacle of the Israelites. In the pagan temples, in this initial space, it was believed that's where the gods would meet. The gods would have dinner. The gods would get drunk on wine. They would make their decisions after they were drunk on wine. It was just this crazy party scene. And the people who served in there, like the priests of the Israelites, the people who served there were there for one reason only, to make sure that the gods' needs were met, that they were appeased so they would not go ballistic on the people. In the holy place for the Israelites, the focus wasn't on the gods. The focus was on God's provision, God's protection, and His love for the people. There were reminders there in the table with the bread on it, in the ornate candelabra that we would call a menorah today, in the incense that floated up to God from that altar of incense. They were not there to curry favor from a capricious God, but to remind the people how good God had been to them. The most holy place was that smaller area, 15 feet in depth, 15 feet wide, 15 feet high. The most holy place, or the holy place, was separated from the outer part of the tabernacle by this heavy curtain, so you couldn't go in by accident. It took effort to get in there, and there was a process and a ritual you had to go through, and only the high priest was allowed to go in, and only once a year. And in those days, there was a very specific ritual that he had to go through, at the risk of his own life if he didn't go through it, in order to secure atonement, forgiveness for the people. The only thing inside the most holy place was the Ark of the Covenant. You probably have some idea about the Ark of the Covenant. Some of you may have seen this movie, The Raiders of the Lost Ark. Remember it? And there are a couple things amazing about this actual clip from The Raiders of the Lost Ark. One is me realizing this week that this movie is almost 40 years old now. And the second is how much of the detail they actually got right in this movie. So the Ark of the Covenant was this wooden box. Simply enough, it was just a wooden box made out of acacia wood. Now, it was a nice wooden box. It was layered on the outside with gold foil. The top of it was spectacular. The top of it was cast to be a single sheet of solid gold. 2 cherubim were on top of it. They were characters the Bible described as worshiping God in His throne room. And they had the body of a lion, the face of a human, and the wings of an eagle. And the eagle's wings were stretched forward, almost to touching on the top of the tabernacle lid. Inside the ark was a pot of manna. There was Aaron's staff that miraculously overnight budded, grew into an almond tree, and bloomed as a mark of God's approval as Aaron as a leader. And then most importantly, inside of it were the 10 Commandments, the actual tablets, the second set Moses brought down from the mountain. And on those tablets, God with His own finger had inscribed those 10 Commandments. In the simplest way I know to say, this Ark of the Covenant was an evidence box with symbols of God's provision, His leadership, and His moral direction for the people. With the completion of the tabernacle, it changed how God spoke, how God related to His people. He did, in fact, move into the neighborhood. It was in the center of the camp, and the Bible says at that point, when it was done, the cloud, remember the cloud that guided them as they're wandering in the wilderness? It now covered the tent of meeting, that outer courtyard, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle itself. And Moses could not even enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord had filled the tabernacle. The glory of the Lord was there. It was God in the most holy place, His presence resting over the ark in this cloud of smoke and fire, right on the surface of the wings of the cherubim on the lid to the ark. And God would appear in the tabernacle and speak to Moses directly. And I have to wonder, with seeing the cloud by day or by night, with God speaking to Moses, if they didn't hear the rumblings, right? Was it like distant thunder they heard as God spoke to Moses. In all the travels of the Israelites, this now became key. Whenever the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, they would set out and follow it. But if the cloud didn't lift, they didn't set out until the day it lifted. And that could be a day, or it could be several months that they would stay in one place. And so the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud at night in the sight of all the Israelites during their travels. God was in the neighborhood. So Darren has multiple times in this series emphasized that he is a skeptic by nature, right? You guys have heard that. If you've been around Westridge for a few years, you've heard it multiple times. He's skeptic by nature. I'm not. I'm more of a trusting person in relationships. When I hear your story, I trust your story. I'm just more of a trusting person. I like to think that I'm more winsome and kind. But even my trusting nature, when I read this, I'm left with some questions, some serious questions. Remember, God says, this is a new way to relate. I'm going to dwell among my people. Really? If you're going to live among your people, why does your dwelling have 2 security fences? The outer fence of the courtyard, 7.5 feet high. The fence around the tabernacle is 15 feet high. And why did God choose to forgive our sins with blood? He is God. It was His. Why blood? Seriously. And why does a priest have to serve as a mediator between the people and God? I mean, it just feels like unnecessary layers in the org chart, right? From our perspective today. And why all the smoke and fire and veils? It's a lot of fuss. I mean, multiple times this week as I was reading through these passages again and again, I started to think, truthfully, the story sounds a lot less like the story of God and more like the Wizard of Oz. Right? I mean, if you are a skeptic, it's a valid thought. I mean, why all the smoke and mirrors, God? What are you up to? I don't mean to be respectful, but it's a crazy amount of ceremony for God to be among His people. I had a lot of questions. I bet you do too as you read the Bible. Some of them get answered and some of them don't. That's why we call it faith. But there are a few things that are clear. Maybe a little different take on the tabernacle than you've ever thought about before. I hope so this morning. That helps us understand the story of God better. I have this firm conviction that when people come to a new faith, it's the whole story of God is overwhelming, even for these Israelites. And so what we need then is we need some simple, doable steps, some easy wins in the Christian life if we're going to start following God. And I think that's right where the Israelites were. This tabernacle provided a simple, visual way that any member of the Israelite nation could approach God. The tabernacle, with all of its ornate decoration and sacrifices, a lot of this procedure, a lot of this practice was already known to them from the nations around them. Maybe they'd even learned it and practiced some of it in Egypt. But God took those practices and attached a new meaning to them. And in so doing, He created a tough but doable set of steps for people to approach Him and begin mending broken places in their relationship with God. For us, it looks complicated, but to them, I think it was common. It was known, and it was a simple beginning. It gave them a physical location where they could experience the presence of God. Each element in the courtyard, in the tabernacle, in the holy place, and in the most holy place, each element told a story. From being confronted with your sin the moment you walked into the courtyard to receiving forgiveness. Every step in the tabernacle, every fixture told a story of the sins that had been covered by God's faithfulness, told the story of His goodness and His grace. It gave common, broken people a way to come into and breathe in a presence of the God they had never known before. There's a question that's been popular in Christian leadership circles for the last 20 years, largely from skeptics, who just ask this question, why in the world do we spend all this money on buildings? I mean, why do we have to do that? Think of all the good that money could do if it were put towards a cause. That's a valid question to ask. For me, as I've wrestled through it, I can feel the presence of God in a lot of places. In these spring and summer mornings, I love to sit on the deck, have my quiet time, because I face the east and I can just watch the sunrise. I feel God's presence there. I've hiked in the Rocky Mountains, and anywhere in the mountains, I love to feel God's presence, and I do in a powerful way. I feel it in a morning stroll along the beach. I feel it in the company of good friends with good food. I feel God's presence. I sense His presence with me in a lot of places and in a lot of ways. But I know that there's something different. There is a power and a strength that comes from being in this place that I don't get anywhere else. There's something about us coming together and worshiping God as His people, wherever we are in our journey at that point. And I love the teaching here, and I love the music here that I get. But it goes even beyond that. I think the primary draw in this community that we've found here and that we're a part of here is that when we walk through those doors on Sunday morning, it really doesn't matter what's happened in our week. It doesn't matter what we've chosen to do or we've ignored doing in the past week. You are welcome here. And if you're doubting God or you're devoted to God, wherever you are in that journey, you're welcome here. You can come early, grab a cup of coffee, stand and talk with friends. You can rush in the door at the last minute and just make the note of the opening song. Or you can come in 30 minutes late, apologizing all the way. It doesn't matter. You are welcome here. Each of us in this room is struggling with something. We are either growing or we're fighting growth in some place in our lives. And what I love about this place, what I've grown to love about Westridge, is that I am immeasurably grateful that this is a place where God meets us. He welcomes us. He heals us. He restores us. He comforts us, and He challenges us. This is a place that stretches my faith, grows my soul. And when I can't make it to church on Sunday, there's a gap in my life. And it's not because of this building. It's not because of any rules we've imposed on the Christian life. I miss this place, and there's a gap in my life because of you and because of Him. The structure is important for us because it gives us a physical location where we can gather together and we can experience a connection with God. And that experience helps us grow in our walk with Jesus in ways nothing else can. Now, let me just share one more idea about the importance of the tabernacle and God's communication with people through it. As a people, this nation of Israel had been beaten into submission in slavery. And now, they had freedom. There were no taskmasters. There was no more brick making. There was none of that. They had freedom, and you would think gaining freedom would make them grateful, right? Grateful to God who showed up and intervened. Grateful to Moses who led them. Grateful to anyone who had a part in securing their freedom. But the truth is, they had a lot of trouble following anybody once they got their freedom. They were hard-hearted. They were rebellious people. And anytime there was any kind of a challenge or difficulty, small or great, they had this standard MO. They'd begin to doubt, and they would question, and they would eventually rebel against Moses and against God. It was crazy because even Moses' closest family, his sister Miriam and his brother Aaron, talked against Moses behind his back. That's crazy to me. They went around saying, who does Moses think he is ordering us around? The people are so bad at following that at one point God changes his mind. Love this. God has said, I will dwell among them. But when the tabernacle is done, God is ready to send the people onto the promised land. All this complaining and all this rebellion, God rethinks his idea of dwelling among them. Listen to what God says to Moses. I want you to go ahead, go up to this land that's full of milk and honey, but I'm not going to travel among you. For you are a stubborn and rebellious people, and if I did, I'd surely destroy you along the way. Did you ever take a road trip with people you felt like that about? Grateful you're not on a spring break road trip with some of them today? Stubborn, argumentative. People on a road trip you wanted to kill or at the very least abandon at a truck stop somewhere in the middle of Nebraska. Moses gets it. He doesn't deny that the people have been rebellious. But he pleads with God. This is one of the most beautiful prayers in all of Scripture, nestled into the heart of Exodus 33. It's a prayer we could pray when we leave our house in the morning, when we leave this place today. Moses says to God, if you don't personally go with us, don't make us leave this place. How's anyone going to know that you look favorably on me and on your people if you don't go with us? Because God, it's your presence among us that sets your people and me apart from all other people on the earth. God, if you won't go with us, don't make us go. It was a big leap for the people to trust God, an unseen spiritual God. Somebody Moses told them about, but they'd never really personally experienced. And after 400 years in slavery, they'd lost their way. And so I think for them, the very first step of faith was to simply trust Moses. If they could see God working in Moses, then maybe their faith would have a chance. And so from that point forward, the Bible tells us God speaks only with Moses. He relates only to Moses. He travels with the people. He dwells among them. And when the cloud filled the tabernacle, Moses went in and met with God. This is beautiful when the Bible says, and God would talk, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as someone speaks to a friend. And then Moses would return to the camp. And when he went back to the camp, he began to teach the people very simple lessons. The cloud is a sign of God's presence. When the cloud lifts and moves, we follow. When the cloud stays, we stay. Just baby steps of faith. And Exodus 33 goes on to say that over time the people began to watch Moses, and they learned to watch the cloud. They didn't have to wait for Moses to say it's time to pack up and go. They knew. And they got to know God and his ways by simply following Moses. I bet that's a similar path to one that most of us in this room have followed. You had a friend. You had a spouse, a neighbor. You began to notice that there was something different about them, different in a good way. You really liked them. You liked being around them. You liked hanging out, having food, having conversation. And over time, what you began to see was that their faith in God was what made them into the person they were. It had a major role in shaping their character, their family life, their choices about how they invest their time and money and where they invest in relationships. That's how it often happens. not just in the early stages of our faith, but in steps of growth. We trust God through someone else's faith. And for most of us, our first step is to trust someone we know. And that leads us to trusting God. When I think about this, I think my very first pastor, I was blessed to be born in a family that worshiped God and went to church every week. So at a week old, I was in church, and Sherwood Smith was my pastor. Sherwood was an amazing man. He was my grandparents' pastor. He was my parents' pastor. He was my pastor for the first 6 or 7 years of my life. His kindness, his teaching, his leading had such a profound impact on me that at different points as I was a toddler, I would look at him and think he was Jesus. I'd call him Jesus. By God's grace and in God's providence, when I went to college at 19 years old, Sherwood was one of my first professors. Who knew that was going to happen? When I was in his presence, I knew clearly he was a man who had been changed by God. It was never a struggle to trust God for Sherwood. And it was never a struggle for me to trust him, to trust his teaching. And Sherwood is just one thread in a rich tapestry of people who've helped shape my faith, grow my faith through the years. Who is that for you this morning? Who are those people you're grateful for that they've come into your life, and wherever your faith was, they helped you grow to the next level, helped you trust God a little more, follow him a little better, understand and receive his grace and forgiveness, embrace his truth and live by it? Who is that for you? My guess is somebody built the bridge for you when fully trusting God seemed like a big step. We need to be grateful for those people and express our gratitude by being that bridge to people in our lives who need that, helping them just take the next steps. When you take the time and read through the biblical account of the tabernacle, what you discover is that Moses and the Israelites toted that tabernacle around the wilderness for 40 years. 7 or 8 tons worth of material. They toted that portable church around the wilderness for 40 years. What's interesting to me is when you begin to plot it out, like go to Google Earth and plot out Egypt to Canaan, and what you begin to realize is even with a slow pace, you can walk from Egypt to Canaan in 10 days. 10 days. The Israelites spent 14,600 days toting that tabernacle around the wilderness. That's a little discouraging. It's also fascinating. Because the more I follow God, the more I'm learning about faith. I begin to realize that when God takes us on a journey, it's not usually about the destination. Whether that destination takes 10 days or 40 years. God is far more concerned about how that journey is shaping us than the destination. Who are we becoming? How is our faith changing us, growing us? Where are we willing to follow God? Are we? Are we willing to follow him wherever he leads us, whenever he leads us? Are we willing to follow him when the journey takes too long and the destination just doesn't seem to make sense? I think we're beginning to understand that the real journey in this life, the one that matters the most, is learning to trust God and to follow him, no matter how or where he leads us.